Ja, einen wunderschönen guten Nachmittag. Ich habe die große Freude und Ehre, hier heute im Namen des ZAZH hier stehen zu dürfen. Der Direktor sitzt hier, das hoffentlich alle wissen, aber ich darf ihn jetzt vertreten und unseren Gast einleiten, weil ich unseren Gast, glaube ich, schon etwas länger kenne als du, Viktor. Und Olivier Hekster hat mir auch nochmal darauf hingewiesen, dass er genau vor 11 Jahren schon mal hier war. Es war mir nicht klar, dass es 11 Jahre sind, aber das ist immer eine gute Zeit. Und ich darf ihn aber trotzdem noch mal ganz kurz vorstellen mit nur wenigen Dingen. Also er ist ja aus Nijmegen zu uns gekommen heute und dort in Nijmegen ist er auch promoviert worden. Er ist seit 2004 dort ordentlicher Professor für alte Geschichte in Nachfolge von Lucas de Blois, den wir hier auch schon gut kennen. Das hört sich jetzt so an, als hätte der gute Olivier sein Leben lang nur langweilig am Schreibtisch in Nijmegen verbracht, was überhaupt nicht der Fall ist. Ich würde ihn ganz frech als Kosmopiloten bezeichnen, denn er war ständig unterwegs zu Forschungsaufenthalten, zu Fellowships und die wichtigsten, weil sie natürlich sehr ehrenvoll sind einmal das Merton College in Oxford, dann war er ein Jahr an der Münchner Kommission für alte Geschichte und Epigraphik und zuletzt 2021 in Münster. Und diese Forschungsaufenthalte waren immer sehr ertragreich für dich, denn du hast eine riesige Liste von Büchern, die du teilweise selbst geschrieben, aber dann auch herausgegeben hast. Und ich möchte nur darauf verweisen, deine Dissertation, ein Werk über den Kaiser Commodus, die preisgekrönt ist und Furore gemacht hat. Und zuletzt 2023 Caesar Rules, also eine weitere Auseinandersetzung mit den römischen Kaiser. Man könnte vielleicht ein bisschen sagen, in Nachfolge, aber auch in Ergänzung zu Fergus Miller, darf man, glaube ich, so sagen. Also wer sich damit mit den Strukturen des Imperium Romanum und vor allem seiner Spitze befasst, kann nicht an Olivier Hekster vorbeigehen. Ja, er ist natürlich Mitglied in Akademien, vor allem natürlich der Königlich Niederländischen Akademie, aber was ich am besten immer von ihm kenne und mit ihm zusammengearbeitet habe, ist sein Vorsitz im großen Network Impact of Empire. Das hat Lucas de Blois begründet, aber du führst es jetzt auch schon fast 20 Jahre, muss man sagen. Und es sind eben nicht nur alle 2 Jahre wichtige Kongresse, die ja vor allen Dingen auch zur Nachwuchsförderung dienen. Also viele junge Kollegen können sich präsentieren erstmals und da dann später sehen wir sie dann wieder als bestellte Kollegen sozusagen auf Professuren. Und es heißt erfolgreich als Publikationsreihe nun geworden. Ich glaube, in 20 Jahren 50 Bände ungefähr sind erschienen. Also das ist ein wahnsinniger Auftrieb hier, den wir haben bei Brill. Sie haben das vielleicht auch schon gesehen, diese Reihe, sehr erfolgreich und immer wichtige Themen, die aufgegriffen werden und dort präsentiert werden. Ja, ich habe es mit den beiden Werken, die ich von dir erwähnt habe, schon gezeigt. Also die römische Welt in ihrer Gesamtheit ist eigentlich dein Thema. Du hast vorhin gesagt, ja, mit dem Kaiser hast du jetzt eigentlich langsam abgeschlossen. Deshalb kommt jetzt zumindest mal der Senat heute dran und du wirst ja auch bald in Rom wieder sein und dort das präsentieren und davon bekommen wir jetzt einen Auszug. Danke, dass du hier bist.
Danke, Anne. 11 Jahre ist eigentlich zu lang, das ist eine gute Zeit. Ich möchte gerne in weniger als 11 Jahren wieder hier sein. Es ist sehr schön, dass Sie alle hier sind. Es tut mir leid, dass der Rest dieses Vortrags auf Englisch geht. Das ist einfach, weil das hier wirklich Work in Progress ist und meine Gedanken sind mir noch nicht total klar und die sind mir auf Deutsch noch viel schlechter klar als auf Englisch. But so it goes. Now, I've been told we have a mixture of an audience of mostly people who know everything about the ancient world and some people who know less of it, so I'll try to sort of start by the basics, not the basics, and then move on. So what I want to talk about today is what I've called a Roman Senate for a global empire, and both terms I think are potentially problematic and certainly contested. So let's start with global empire. And this, again, apologies if this is completely familiar to you. I would argue that the Roman Empire as a global empire should not be a contested concept. It is an empire that is inherently connected. It is both connected within the scope structure of the Roman Empire, which encompasses 3 continents to begin with, and what you see on the left top is shipwrecks. Now, if you have lots of shipwrecks, you have lots of connectivities, because on the whole ships sail a lot before they sink. So if you have one ship that sunk, then there's lots of connections before. So if we have lots of shipwrecks all over the Mediterranean and beyond, that shows a world that is within itself, within the continents, extremely connected. Left bottom, I always put in a slide of the Orbis project because there are still people who don't know the project. The Orbis project is the best invention since sliced bread. It's in Stanford, Walter Scheider and his team have accumulated all the data of how long and how difficult it is to travel from any location within the Roman Empire to another, which is a wonderful website. But when you start to think about it, the fact that we have the data for this, the fact that we have so many texts and so much material that allows us to think about how long it takes to travel in certain distances and certain seasons and with certain modes, shows that people were perpetually writing about it, thinking about it, and doing it. So again, this shows an intrinsically connected world within, but also increasingly clear outside of the Roman Empire, so global in the true sense of the world. So on the right bottom, my other favorite website, I'll stop with showing you favorite websites in a bit, but they are so cool. This is the Roman Coin Hoard project from Chris Howdigo at the University of Oxford, and what it shows is all coins that are found in situ. So we can have a hoard consisting of a single coin. It has, at the moment, 11 million coins in it or something like that. And this is a heat map with all the finds. And the important thing is you cannot see the borders of the Roman Empire on this map. Right? This is where coins are found. We see an enormous number of coins found in the Indian Peninsula, enormous number of coins found in what we call the Barbaricum. So trade certainly outside of what we traditionally call the Roman Empire as well, and the periplus and the intrinsic and increasing attention for the trade to India, again makes clear that we are talking about a world that is inherently global. Okay, so that's point one. Now, this is not my observation. In the past decade and a half, people have been talking about globalization as a concept with which to think about the Roman world. And what these studies, and I think these are the main ones, have done, but there's much more, have done, is effectively 2 things. It's on the one hand, showing all the people looking at modern globalization that there is a deep history and this happened before, so their universal claims may not be as universal as they say, and they may not be as unique as they say on the one hand. So this is contextualizing through deep history modern approaches, which is interesting but not what I want to do today. What they also do is use concepts from global dynamics, globalization studies as sort of eye-openers to look at our material, to concept that can help us to frame and interpret the evidence that we have from the ancient world. And I think that is, for today, certainly the more interesting approach. Last bit of introduction, and then we'll get interesting bits of evidence. There's all sorts of criteria for globalization and people thinking about why and how we can apply globalization to the ancient world. I'm not going to list all of these. This is from Jennings' wonderful world. He was also on the last slide. But these are all concepts that apply to globalized worlds, globalized societies, and allow us to recognize that all of these apply to the ancient world as well. But they're also frameworks through which we can look at our evidence. And certainly the notion of deterritorialization, which is a word I dare you to say rapidly 3 times in a row, unevenness, and also the time-space compression are terms that I think are going to be extremely useful, at least for me, were useful to start thinking about how the Roman world actually worked and how the Roman Senate actually worked. Okay, so this was the global empire part of it, and we will return to the relevant bits of this later on. Now, the other part is a Roman Senate. Now, at a very, very basic level, the Senate wasn't Roman, right? The first person to be a Senate or even a consul born outside of Rome is already Balbus. So Balbus, through his alliance with Caesar and later Augustus, gets pushed up to consul. He was born in Gades. So he's nationalized as a Roman. He gets the Roman citizenship, but obviously his origo isn't Rome. So once we get to the famous decision of Claudius to systematically include as senators member from outside the Italian peninsula, that is simply a continuation of a practice that was already there. And this is the big one, and one that we all talk about, and it's important. It shows there's protest, and there's an awareness that these people, that this is something different. But the bog obvious point is that from very early onwards, certainly in the Roman Empire, so the period from Caesar Augustus onwards, the Roman Senate partly consists of people who aren't born in the Italian peninsula. Now, this is very often used as an example to talk about the integration of Rome. Rome as a properly integrated system in which representation is important, and Rome takes its subject seriously and allows representation from throughout the empire to be there. So as a very positive multicultural story, and Nandi Pandi, in a forthcoming book on diversity in the Roman world, argues that Rome is at its heart a nation of immigrants built on a foundation of pragmatic pluralism, and the Senate is part of that. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but certainly the idea of a Roman Senate is a weird one, because the senators clearly to a large extent aren't. To what extent they aren't is much discussed, and I could spend the next hour and a half, I shan't, talking about exact numbers of all senators coming from different areas. I like to refer you to a wonderful recent article by John Weisweiler, from whom I've nicked all of these stats and most of these images, and he set out, based on earlier work by certainly Halfman's been doing a lot of this, Duncan Jones been doing a lot on this, of the numbers of senators from the different areas, and two things are striking, or lots of things are striking, but two things are striking, I think. One is that the number of provinces from which the vast majority of the senators stems is relatively limited, right? This is the big argument of John Weisweiler, is that you see, if you take Baetica, Narbonensis, Asia, and Africa, you have about 80% of all senators, and that they obviously get included into the Senate at different paces. Different numbers, this is from Duncan Jones, but it's showing the same argument again. We have increasing numbers of senators from the provinces also taking up the highest functions, right? So this is the number of consuls, provincial consuls. These are high percentages. So people who weren't born in the Italian peninsula, who come to Rome as senator, rise up to the consulate, and these numbers are really, really substantial. There seems to be, as Duncan Jones pointed out, still an awareness that they weren't really Roman, and that they seem to get different functions. So although we have a Senate that consists of people from throughout the empire, or a part of throughout the empire, and they are included, and they rise to the consulate, the percentage of high functions taken up by provincial is lower than the number of provincials in the Senate. Okay? Is that clear? And if you look at that slide, it's actually notable that provincials seem to have held more posts outside of Rome, especially at the more dangerous frontier regions. Now, you can take this several ways. You can say the more dangerous frontier regions are the areas where you want to have people who have expertise of the area to which they were sent. So you sent the people with expertise. You can also say you sent the people with the lowest social stratum to go to the areas of risk. Right? I'm not making a statement as to which of the ones it is, but both arguments work. But if you summarize all of this material, what you effectively see, if you take the period from Augustus up to the period of the Severi, the number of Italian senators drops dramatically. The number of senators from the western provinces develops unequally. It has a boom and then it drops again. Eastern provinces seem to mostly boom and the African provinces come in late. Now, if I'm not going to push this argument even further, and I should have pushed it further, but Nicholas doesn't make such nice images as John Weisweiler, so all the work he's done on the background of senators I can't bring in. But roughly speaking, this argument continues, right? So we get, from what I get the sense of it, you get a slight increase of Africa, you get a continuing increase of Asia. Western provinces seem to become smaller in its layout, the Italian peninsula increasingly smaller. So we have a global Senate for a global empire, right? It's very easy. I'm done. It gets slightly trickier. I talked earlier about the uneven spread. This shows you where senators come from, and you see that there's an uneven spread, right? So what you see is, although we have a global Senate for a global empire, there are certain parts of the Roman world which are much better represented than others. Now, if we are talking about this notion of the Senate as a representative unit, this notion of the Senate including people from outside of the Italian peninsula in order to show a proper representation of the empire as a whole, one would expect it to be a representation of the empire as a whole, which it isn't. Now, one probable reason for this is that the areas that are more represented than others are those where it is easiest to have proper wealth accumulation. So these are the areas that benefited most in economic terms. Life for the people there needn't necessarily have been fun, but benefited most in economic terms from being part of a connected empire. So by being part of an empire with a clear market, not just in Rome, but in some of the other cities as well, certainly Narbonensis and Africa and Baetica and Asia allowed for more wealth accumulation, and if you have a certain amount of wealth accumulation, then certain members of the elites that live there will accumulate that wealth for themselves, and that is a necessity for becoming a senator. Effectively, senators in Rome are those with enough wealth to no longer be ignored. So we have a basis of wealth, and it seems to be that certain areas are more represented than others. We even know where they really came from. Focusing on Asia and Africa for a bit, we can trace the specific cities, with numbers again, where senators come from. Now, on the one hand, I can push the argument I just made about just a limited sample being there. I think altogether there are about 200 cities from which we know that a senator stemmed. I wasn't going to do emperors again, it's just sort of Freudian slip, where senators stemmed out of the thousands of cities that we have. Right? That, on the other hand, this is still a very distributed background of the people in the Senate. So although the subset of cities from which senators stem is limited, it is still a very, very large number, and it is distributed throughout the Roman world. And importantly, if you start playing with orbis again, to get from these individual places to Rome takes a substantial amount of time. Now, if the basis of being a senator is to a large extent having the wealth to be a senator, and this is simplifying but not wrong, and if the basis of that wealth is in these areas that are intrinsically connected to the Roman world and have the advantage of having the wealth accumulation, then you want to make sure that they continue to be profitable. On the whole, estates do not entirely run themselves. And even though a lot was done by middlemen, we know that senators with a certain regularity want to be present. We know we have one wonderful letter of Pliny, it's 10:8, in which he actually asks Trajan for a month's leave from the Senate because he has to settle economic affairs in his estates near Tiferi and Tiberinum. Now that's 150 miles from Rome, and he wants to be away from a month. If you want to get to Lepcis Magna, according to Orbis, with sort of good weather, in the right season, with a good surveys, it takes you 12.5 days to get there and 12.5 days to get back. That's near, right? Thuga, Bulla Regia, those are areas you can get there in 12 days, traveling and back. You've not been there yet. Once we get to Asia, and you get to the hinterland of Asia, and we do have cities. Do you see the mouse here at all? No, you don't. We do have cities here at the end, sort of Agmonea, or Aizano, or Dosilayan, where we know that senators came from, we know that senators had land. It takes you 30 days to get there. So these global senators, or these senators from all over the world in the Roman Senate, if they were to take care of their estate, they'd potentially have a problem. Okay, that's the only observation so far. There is a potential problem. So why are we talking about a Roman Senate? So why did none of you look surprised when you saw the title Roman Senate? I sort of want to make the wager that if you looked at the title at all, the global empire bit was the one that you thought, oh, I wonder what he wants to say about that. The Roman Senate seems self-evident, whereas effectively, that the Roman Empire was global is completely self-evident, and that the Senate was Roman isn't. It's because the senators want us to think that. So certainly from the reign of Augustus onwards, the Roman Senate has done its utmost to present itself as a substantiated corporate body. Amy Russell's work on this in the past decades has been very, very clear. What she's shown is that because you got an emperor, which meant that, I'm going to talk about emperors after all. Okay, because you had an emperor, it meant that the role of the Senate needed to change, which meant that one way of doing that is the Senate to develop itself as a corporate body with an entity standing against the emperor, right? And one way of doing that is showing this continuous group of senators developing the genius of the Senate, inventing the Fasti Triumphalis with a complete, continuous history of exactly all the senators who'd done the triumphal tours. And you've got a complete subset of fake history and invented history that shows continuous history of the Senate in Rome. Right? This is the invention, as it were, of a Roman Senate. It's the image of the Senate as a corporate body, as a group of people, the Senate, rather than individual senators, and it is housed in Rome. It is focused on Rome. And this image continues over time. So when you look at the Prefectio in the panel relief of Marcus Aurelius, you have the genius of the Senate waving the emperor off, and he does that within an urban context that to the audience would have been recognizably the city of Rome. When you get to the Sacchetti relief, you have Severus presenting Caracalla to the senators, to the Senate, again in a setting of the city of Rome. So we have this image of a localized Senate, that is certainly put forward by senators themselves and by the emperor. It goes slightly further than that, because it's not just the Arapakis and the coins and nice big imperial reliefs. It's also walking around in the city of Rome. Chenot's work on senators in the Forum of Trajan has shown us, it's mainly used to talk about late antique senators and late antique statuary, but he's shown that really from the time of Marcus Aurelius onwards, we have statues of senators clearly in the Forum of Trajan and in other areas of the city, showing their presence there. It's the second population of Rome, and this continues throughout. So we have senators there clearly as senator, with a cursus honorum telling us that they are senators, dotted all around the place. So we have these Roman senators there, and it's not just their statues, it's also their tombs. Recent work by Barbara Bork has made very clear that we actually have quite a lot of monuments for senators in Rome, and we have quite a lot of monuments for senators who weren't born in Rome, but are buried in Rome. So the Servilii and the Valerii, who are from Hippo Regius and Freius, are buried in a tomb in the city of Rome, in an architecture that is particularly Roman, and they do that in sarcophagi in which they also shout, "Hi, I am as traditionally Roman as they come." So if one looks at the sarcophagi, the imagery on the tombs really mirrors the underlying principles of elite republican competition. So we get ancestral lineage, you get public officers, you get a relatively fixed set of virtues, which are all shown on these sarcophagi by the senators who weren't originally born in Rome. The Clupeus on the top left, and even can't read that inscription, and that's not your eyes, that's the image. But it shows the son of earlier consuls. So this notion of lineage, this continuation of, possibly even creation of, a Roman senatorial elite based in Rome, placed in Rome, and buried in Rome is particularly poignant. And it seems that the majority of senators was buried in Rome. The recent book by Thomas Knozala, Grabrepräsentation, 2 years ago, argues that the vast majority of senators is buried in Rome, even if they are originally not from Rome. It's slightly problematic. I think he's right. He knows much more about the material than I do, but there's obviously a sort of problem with looking at the material that you have, whereas there's lots of material that we don't have, because there's lots of material of graves outside of Rome that we no longer have. So you're not really comparing like with like. We don't quite, because you get a slightly circular argument in the sense that we know which senators are not originally from Rome, because we found their grave and their gravestones, and these are mainly found in Rome, and therefore the vast majority of the senators who aren't from Rome are buried in Rome. But obviously there's a slight bias in the material. But he's probably right that we have at least a large subset of senators who abided by this corporate Roman image. Right? So this is the Roman Senate. This is a group of senators who, even if they weren't originally from Rome, presented themselves as Roman and were seen as Roman. Easy enough. But this balance between a corporate image, to an extent an accepted and self-perpetuated corporate image of a Roman senator, and a senator who is part of a global empire with vested interest, that tension is visible in the material as well. And I think that tension is worth focusing on much more than people have done. So the remainder of this paper is going to be focusing on that tension. And to me, again, it's evident. Mostly when you read about this material, people say the Senate, as an institute that's based in Rome, is even legally described because various passages in the digest point out how senators have domicile in Rome. And that's effectively what these texts say. They have domicile in the city of Rome. They are deprived of the benefit of their birthright, but still remain the municipal dignity. Senators are always considered to have their residence at Rome. So this is all supporting this argument. But people tend to forget that the passage actually goes on. Still, they are understood to have a residence in the place where they were born too, for the reason that the rank of senator is considered rather to give an additional domicile than to challenge your one. So they are Roman, but being Roman is not seen to exclude not being Roman. You're Roman and not Roman, rather than Roman or non-Roman. And this led to real tensions. There's the famous letter of Pliny to Nepos saying, he has issued order that all candidates shall have invested a third of their patrimony in land. He very justly took the view that it was disgraceful that candidates for public office should regard Rome and Italy not as their mother country, but as a mere inn or lodging place in which they were staying as travelers. And that third of your money becomes a fourth of your money under Marcus Aurelius. Now, these passages to me say two things very loudly. One is, there was apparently a problem with a large group of senators who considered Rome not as their mother city, but as an inn, who were not sufficiently committed to substantially spending time in Rome. And the reason for that seems to be that the vast majority of their possessions weren't in the Italian peninsula and they couldn't travel to it. Werner Eckert has at some stage argued that the fact that you have these rules is to do with the fact that now people had the money to invest in the more expensive ground in Italy. I think that's turning the argument around. And I think he's returned on this argument as well. This is forcing people to invest in the Italian peninsula to make sure that they are investing in the Italian peninsula and they're close to Rome. That seems much more obvious an explanation for this. Also, and again, good to think with, the fact that we have laws about residence means that it's contested. And the fact that we have a repeated law about residence means that the original law wasn't sufficiently clear. This is the good thing about law. If you have a law, it means there's a normative problem and someone needs to solve it. And if you have the repetition of a law, it means that the original law didn't work. Here we have several laws dealing with the residence of senators in Rome. So this isn't an unproblematic issue. People were aware that there was a problem. Here it becomes slightly more speculative, but there seem to be even a number of equestrians who have turned down position of senators, and Richard Talbot and David van Berghem have argued that this is possibly to do with the fact that they didn't want to get rid of their much more profitable positions elsewhere. It's possible. I have to say that the complete list that John Bodell has of equestrians turning down senatorial position has 17 men. That's not a really, really large group. And none of these people turning it down have given a very explicit reason, apart from occasionally saying, I don't want to be landed with the burden and the responsibility. None of them says, I actually want to stay at home and mind my garden. But then again, you wouldn't, would you? You see that there is a problem indirectly elsewhere when Caracalla is complaining about that they're not just lazy in all other respects, but they don't assemble with enough numbers, they don't have the votes. That seems to suggest that we do have a problem with people not sufficiently often being present in Rome to vote. And this coincides with the period in which we have a much larger subset of people coming from the more remote part of the empire, remember the earlier images, than we had before. Also laws on the Marcianus, later on the Severus and Caracalla, arguing that senators cannot be compelled to administer a guardianship beyond a certain distance, suggests that there was an attempt to make sure that senators didn't have excuses, obligations, whatever term you want to use, to spend time remote from Rome. So again, all of this shows that there is an awareness of a problem of these very, very Roman senators not being Roman, but being all over the empire, and thereby not being in the Senate, notwithstanding the fact that you have a very strict schedule of what senators need to do. There's massive votes. You need to be at the offerings for the Alvan Brethren. There is a whole series of jobs that need to be in the Italian Peninsula and Rome. So although there is a clear notion that a senator needs to be in Rome, the corporate idea of senators at Rome, the image of senators as very Roman, there's also a clear show that they weren't there very often. Moreover, senators didn't really want them to travel all that much. Now, I accept that this is partly to do with safety. You don't want your senators all over the place. But again, it shows this indication that there's a tension, at least, between this idea of a centralized Senate and the practice of senators as individuals who want to be and need to be all over the place. That's partly even emotional. So this is Cassius Dio. Here we have the text of a senator who isn't born in Rome, talking about all this. And he says towards the end of his work, he did not spend much time in Rome at the end because he went to Asia, to Bithynia, fell sick, hastened to Africa. That's all job work. That's all true. But then, on returning to Italy, I was almost immediately sent as governor to Dalmatia and Upper Pannonia. And though after that I returned to Rome and Tentacomania, I at once set out for home. I should have put the Greek in there. It's oikade. It's really going home. Likewise, later, I set out for home with the intention of spending all the rest of my life in my native land. So there is certainly the idea post-retirement, or whenever you can, that you want to spend time in Rome. This is very different from this idea of a very Roman senator who has his statues in Rome and has his tomb in Rome. We even have this wonderful cenotaph just outside of Rome of Annia Regilla, the wife of Herodes Atticus, which on the one hand shows how very senatorial this family is, but then explicitly says, yeah, but she's not lying here, she's really lying in Greece where we belong. So this tension between having to present yourself in Rome, being part of a Roman elite, but at the same time still being very much both emotionally and economically part of a patria is there. It is clear in the evidence. And that, I think, is partly also the reason why we have all these inscriptions, and this is not me assembling them. They've been there from Richard Tolber's wonderful work, from which I've nicked so much. It's really, 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 really brilliant. And all later work, about all these senators shouting, I'm the first one from consul from Africa. I am the first one from Xanthus, first of the Tubicidani. I am the first Ephesian to be consul. The fifth man ever in the Senate, the fifth man. I find that one actually the most interesting one, because the first person in the Senate is easy. But the fifth man means that you keep track. This remains something important both for the location. And yes, there is an argument to be had that these are all inscriptions set up by others to honor someone from their hometown. But that isn't actually the case, because we know involvement of non-Roman senators in their hometown setting up statues to themselves, or having statues set up to themselves, after they retire in their hometown. So we know that Antius Quadratus, who is the first senator from the east to be consul, retires to Pergamum and then has a number of statues set up to him in Pergamum. not in Rome. And Minicius Natalis Verus wants a quadriga to be set up in Barsino, northern Rome, probably because he retired there. So although we have a lot of senators being buried in Rome, we clearly also have a substantial subset of senators retiring to their home city, much like Dio intends to do, and being celebrated there. So that connection of being very much non-Roman, but being local, is clearly there, and we don't need the famous inscription of Pliny with all the sort of material he keeps giving to Como, his hometown, to know that senators had a fairly strong connection to that hometown. No example probably better than this one. I put it in because I was asked to provide a pretty picture for this lecture, and I thought, ooh, what is a pretty picture of a senator not from Rome doing things outside of Rome? Well, this is it. Right? This is Celsus on his statue base, clearly identifying himself as a consul and a proconsul, part of the senatorial order, Greek inscription under it, very much a Roman person, giving a whopping massive monument to his home city and making sure everyone really knows that he's left up, was it 25,000 denarii to pay for 12,000 scrolls? And even if it's his son doing it, the statement is the same, and the fact that his sarcophagus is there under it within the city walls shows you the exceptional position he can have in his hometown. So this is very much a strong subset of senators who can shine at home, who can be much more prominent at home than they could have been in Rome. So this is non-Roman senators in the provinces, in the global empire. They don't present themselves as Roman here. They present themselves as local and part of a senatorial, deterritorialized elite, a group that isn't limited to one specific area, but is still recognizable to all people. We can hold the same story, and I'll briefly hold the same story, in North Africa as well. Lots of work done on building inscriptions, honors being given, statues being erected, monuments being erected, and on the whole, what you see is certain families, such as the Flavi Pudentis in Timgad or Rogatianus in Timgad, giving massive gifts to their home provinces. Same in Lepkes Magna, Plautii, and Silii, very much present. And the cool thing for the senators is that, as opposed to local magistrates, they gave real benefactions because there was no obligation for a senator to give munera in his hometown. Senators were legally accepted from that obligation. So their gifts were real gifts. So you can be even more of a group rising over the local elite. You get this deterritorialized elite over the elite, which is not appointed by anyone in local situations. So wonderful work by Monica Hellström shows that much of the building inscriptions is about competition, who's top dog in a certain area and who is allowed to go to Carthage. Senators aren't part of that equation because they don't have to. They are senators. They can show themselves as senators and continue to do that. And they continue to have those strong links that we saw with Pliny as well, in that we know that Fronto, for instance, continues to boost his people to Cirta. I'm now still allowed to have 5 minutes, right? Because you have my introduction. That'll do. Now, this notion of a deterritorialized elite we also see possibly in an unexpected place. When Herodes Atticus writes to Avidius Cassius after his ill-fated rebellion, "You are mad," the famous one-word letter, we tend to forget that apparently Herodes Atticus wrote a letter to Avidius Cassius in the middle of an ill-fated rebellion. Right? This shows a level of connectedness between senators that we tend to forget. The fact that Cassius was so successful, and so successful that Marcus Aurelius then ended up forbidding senators to be governor in their hometown, shows you again that strong connection that senators had in their home provinces. So all of this shows uneven distribution of importance in different areas. This also applies to trade. Senators were heavily involved in trading. And all the ideas that they weren't allowed to trade, there were all nice loopholes through it. We have Palmyrene senators, part of tax collectors. It seems increasingly clear that senators were involved in the trade to India. So the senators, with their involvement at local level, also have important trade networks that go well beyond and outside of Rome. And they take the decisions about what you can do with these trade networks. And whenever senators start to talk about, emperors start to talk about differences with the taxes, as Nero does, senators suddenly come in uprise because this goes against their vested interest. And already Whitaker, that is sort of 50 years ago, shown very clearly that moment we get the Spanish and Gallic senators as part of the elite in Rome, we get an influx of Gallic and Spanish oil, and the oil and garum from Africa goes with the senators. So we have really a very strong link with this trade network. So how about this corporate image that I talked about before? Well, I think it actually falls flat most of the time. I think it's our problem. So I've looked up coins. So I thought, oh, for this, I'll look up all the coins with the Roman Senate on it. There's 80. There's 80 types. But the types are, on the whole, not extremely popular types. That's nothing. And they aren't placed in Rome. So if you look at helmeted Roma, you have 1184 types, and that's very few either. So likewise, Senate on provincial coinage, about 600, doesn't really seem to change with the distribution of senators. So this idea of a Roman Senate seems not to really be distributed through the empire. You have it in Rome with your reliefs and your tombs and your statuary, but you don't have it elsewhere. We get a bit of an Italian Senate at a certain stage when the status of the province of Italy shifts, and this is what people have been talking about. But actually, once you start to talk about that, very little is being said about the Senate anymore. This is about Rome and Italy being central rather than the Senate. So there's very, very little idea of a Roman Senate, corporate Roman Senate, outside of the city of Rome. In fact, under Caracalla, allegedly, or at least Herodian thinks that this is a possibility, there's an argument between the senators who came from Europe and the senators who came from over there. Right? Probably a fiction, this idea that we're going to split the empire. But the fact that Herodian can write several times in his work about the difference between the senates from the west and the senates from the east shows an awareness that senators came from different places and that mattered. We don't have a Senate. We have senators. Now, just because Anna's in this room, I've tried to look at images of the Roman Senate outside of the empire. And the best bit I could get out is on your article on the Chinese embassy, in which you, I think, convincingly point out that this text about the ruler not being permanent and traveling around and having letters in a bag and roaming around isn't about the emperor, but is about governors. This is Chinese being surprised about governors having to roam around their province, listening to petitions, listening to others, being replaced. That's the only bit of evidence of possibly someone outside of the empire talking about a senator that I could find. And it's not about the Senate as a corporate body. So this idea of the Senate as a corporate body is a fiction. And it's a fiction that continues to exist. Because in Constantinople, we get the same problem all over again with exactly the same laws we had before about being allowed to be in the city, having domicile, not having domicile, because senators were still from all over the place. But they still needed to be localized in this corporate Senate for a global empire. So, if you want to get back to the concepts that I started with and the concept that helped me to think about this, I would say that thinking in terms of time-space compression allows you to see that this assumed corporate Roman identity makes us underplay the status of senators in the provinces. The world had become smaller. It became a world that was intrinsically connected. So just looking at Rome and thinking, ooh, but this was so far away, it must be different, isn't the way it worked. People were thinking about the world as a whole and were aware of economic and cultural necessities all over the empire, or even beyond, if one takes the Indian trade in consideration. And that we seem to have the development of a group of people standing outside of the city of Rome, outside of the spectrum, a sort of deterritorialized group that felt itself as global and was in touch with one another and did say you're completely out of your mind when you rebelled against the emperor. This letter, I think matters. And one problem, if we look too much about Rome and the Senate as a body, is also that we forget the unevenness, that the importance that these senators, that this ground had for senators, and therefore the decision they took about the empire held. Now, perhaps you don't need globalization for this, but I think it does help you to think with these terms, to see these problems. Now, the late, great Fergus Miller, a long, long time ago, talking about, not quite this, but talking about Senate and their relationship to Rome, said the republic it may be can be seen from Rome outwards. To take this standpoint, for the empires to lose contact with reality. Not only the pattern of literary evidence or the evidence of an immense mass of local documents, existence of an immense mass of local documents, but the very nature of the empire itself means that it can only be understood by starting from the provinces and looking inwards. Now, this was an extremely important observation, and Fergus was entirely right, but he also was intrinsically wrong. Because by starting from the provinces and looking inwards, you're still looking at Rome. And one of the advantages of thinking in global terms is that you decenter. Roman senators weren't Roman, they weren't provincial, they were both at the same time. We shouldn't start at the provinces and look at Rome. We certainly shouldn't start at Rome and look at the provinces, but one should start to look at all these different areas as a conglomeration of interest and ideas and identities. And that is what I am trying to do and have tried to do in just over 45 minutes. So thank you very much.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Olivier,
Gerne.
für dieses breite Bild der Senatoren. Ich glaube, es ist schon interessant, vor allen Dingen die Karten, die du am Anfang gezeigt hast, fand ich sehr beeindruckend, nochmal diese Verteilung auch zu sehen, jetzt mal im Detail. Ich meine, die Forschungen kennen wir natürlich, ja, genau, aber das mal wirklich so lokalisiert zu sehen, macht es nochmal wirklich, wirklich deutlicher. Und dann auch deine nächste Folie, wo du zeigst, wie die Verhältnisse sich ändern. Das fand ich sehr schwer. Ja, genau. Das, denke ich, ist sehr instruktiv, um mal zu sehen, also Umschichtungen finden einfach statt und das hat verschiedene Gründe. Du hast einen Grund genannt, das muss vielleicht nicht alle überzeugen. Vielleicht darf ich erstmal Sie fragen, wie Ihre Wünsche und Fragen sind. Ich habe nachher ein paar Fragen, aber ich will mich jetzt nicht vordrängen. Es gibt vielleicht andere dringende Bedürfnisse an Fragen, die erstmal geklärt werden sollen.
Und Fragen können, das machst du auch klar, auf Deutsch gestellt werden und ich werde mal sehen, auf welche Sprache ich die dann beantworte. Genau. Wenn es zu schwierig wird, mache ich es auf Holländisch.
Das ist dann Challenge für uns. Da sind Sie näher dran.
Ja, vielen Dank für den Vortrag. Also meine Frage geht zunächst hinsichtlich zu dem Problem, das Sie erwähnt haben, dass es für die Senatoren ein Problem darstellen würde, ihre Ländereien abseits von Rom zu bewirtschaften oder zu kontrollieren. Da haben Sie die Mittelmänner erwähnt, die Middlemans, aber es gibt ja noch Familie, es gibt eben Vertrauenspersonen. Und wenn man denen vertraut, dann kann man das ja auch mit Briefverkehr überwinden, sollte es nicht zu einer Krise tatsächlich auch kommen. Und das Beispiel von Plinius zeigt ja auch, es geht ja ihm weniger darum, zu sagen, dass es Probleme in seinem Landbesitz geht, sondern zu zeigen, dass er eben Landbesitz hat seiner literarischen Öffentlichkeit hin. Und das wäre die eine Frage. Und die andere Frage geht dahingehend, also diese Zentralisierung in Rom, ob das auch eine Vertrauensfrage ist des Kaisers gegenüber den Senatoren. Dadurch, dass, wie Sie auch schön gezeigt haben, der Senat in dem Sinne globaler wird, sinkt natürlich auch die Peer Group dessen, deren Personen er persönlich kennt. Und durch die Nähe in Rom kann er vielleicht hier durch Vertrauen zu Personen aufbauen, die er dann eben in die Provinzen hineinschicken kann, um solche Fälle zu vermeiden, wie mit Avidius Cassius, was Sie auch erwähnt haben.
Okay, both are absolutely right. And yes, we know about family, and we know about middleman, and we know about all sorts of ways of going it. And I think you're right that for the vast majority of time, this would go well, right? At the same time, we do know several examples, Fronto is another one, of emperors asking to be allowed to leave, right? So I'd be surprised if all goes through letters. We know that there are too few senators at certain stages in the Senate because we get this complaint about non-attendance. We know that at a certain stage under Vespasian, there's a number of people going to Alexandria. This may not be connected entirely to having to deal with your economic backdrops, but I'd be surprised if it isn't. So evidence is, this is circumstantial. You're absolutely right. If one looks at modern comparisons, doing everything by letters is problematic, and at certain stages people do come in to solve the problems when they're there. And I think that considering the fact that we have such a long period that traveling takes, it becomes more problematic. So you may be right. It may not be no, I don't. I think it is a proper reason that you want to take care of your possessions. And yes, Pliny is always making a literary example of everything. That's the problem with Pliny, or that's the great thing of Pliny. It's self-representation at the same time. But he couldn't make this statement if it had been insane, right? This is one of the ways in which I work with literary evidence. An audience needs to accept it as an acceptable possibility for it to work. So this wasn't a weird suggestion. So the combination of that, to me, means it's likely that senators would still want to travel with some regularity to the areas, which again, the example of Dio shows in a different light. So that's one. The other question, declaration of intent. I've spent 20 years working on emperors and relations to emperors and senators, and I'm completely fed up with emperors. So I have no interest of thinking about the relation between emperors and senators ever again. But you're probably right that I can't entirely take it out of this equation. To an extent, I think I want to argue against your suggestion, because what you often read is the position of the Senate, this corporate Italian Roman Senate, consists to a large extent because the emperor is in Rome and you have the vicinity and the possibility to approach him and the networks. And once the emperor goes away in the 3rd century and 4th century is less in Rome, that also shows that the power of the Senate becomes smaller. That is, to an extent, the repercussion of the argument you're making. And I think that's not actually true, because senators remain important and they keep holding their strong links to the local areas, because otherwise there wouldn't be a reason to prohibit them from going to these areas. So yes, there is a trust question there, but I'm not sure that needs to be linked to Rome. Does that make sense as an answer? Not entirely?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, no.
Danke, das war sehr spannend und überzeugend, fand ich. Ich wollte gerne fragen zu dieser Corporate Identity, wie die genau entsteht. Ich überlege mir gerade im Moment, dass Augustus da eine wichtige Rolle spielt, dass er das auch bewusst prägt, den Senat in eine bestimmte Position hineinbringt, den Senat auch umstrukturiert. Ich frage mich dann, inwiefern beispielsweise Cicero da reinspielt, also einfach als erste Frage, wie die zustande kommt. Und das Zweite, dass ich mich frage, wie die Senatoren selbst diese Corporate Identity nutzen. Ist es einerseits ein Schutz, also da kann man auch gegen den Kaiser vorgehen. Ich denke an 238, das 6. Kaiserjahr, wenn der Senat gegen Maximinus Thrax sich erhebt und sagt, so nicht, auch weil der Senat als Hüter der Mores gilt, oder ob das auch kritisch gesehen wird, also bei Tacitus, dass man dann sagt, das ist nicht das, was der Senat oder eben die Senatoren sein sollten, wie das bespielt wird. Danke vielmals.
That's a very big question, and so the idea of corporate identity, unfortunately, isn't mine, but is Amy Russell's. So she, and I think very convincingly showed that exactly the period you're talking about, the moment Augustus is in this situation in which he's doing what Augustus is doing, which we're not going to go into now. He needs to show that that senators are still relevant in order not to get dead. And one way of doing that is by saying, oh, you are such an important body of people together. This also, of course, allows these senators, for whom it is extremely clear that for the past decades they've not been relevant. Right? I think we tend to forget when we talk about Augustus that this is the end product of half a century of non-functioning government. We have half a century of crisis in which senators were not irrelevant, but they didn't function properly. For senators, it's also an excuse to become a relevant partner again. So I think this is mutual interest, which is why you take it up, why it's useful for the individual senators to be part of the Senate, to create this group, and important for emperors to have someone to play off against. And you're absolutely right, and I've not sufficiently thought about criticism within the Senate about that. And I think you're right that this is the sort of thing that Tacitus is doing, that there's still the sort of background idea that senators ought to be more than just this rubber stamping body. So yeah, I think that's right and a good addition. Thank you.
Also ich mich gefragt habe, gibt es einen Unterschied zwischen den Senatoren aus den Ostprovinzen und denen aus den Westprovinzen, oder ist das eher ein Quellenproblem?
Ooh, that's fun. I don't know. One could expect, sort of gut feeling is that in the East and Africa, the hometowns are so much more developed and the infrastructure of giving benefactions, etc., is more developed that it's easier to do it there. On the other hand, there's more scope for reward if you go to the West. Certainly in Baetica, we have the same pattern. So I could have done the same for Baetica, I think, as I've done for the East and Africa. If you go further to the North, there is not a single senator known from Belgica. So there's none from Britain. So the West is a limited part. I think that's mainly the Hispanias. I don't know. It's worth looking into. It certainly is also a source problem. But whether that is only a source problem or whether that source problem shows that we really have a different pattern, I don't know. I need to think about that. Thank you.
Gerade anschließend vielleicht an das, die Folie eins vorher, glaube ich, die Sie gezeigt haben, da, was mich gewundert habe, was ich mich, vielleicht auch nicht, die Übersicht, ja genau das, okay, dass Ägypten fehlt als Provinz für Senatoren und der Wealth Accumulation, die Sie erwähnt haben, das wäre ja in Ägypten auch der Fall durch die Globalisation und den Handel mit Indien. Das kommt ja alles über Ägypten dann rein. Warum gibt es so wenige Senatoren von Ägypten?
There's one in the post-Constitution Antoniniana, so it's really, really very late. Easy answer is read John Weisweiler in Past and Present, because he's actually developed this theory. It's partly to do with the estates. So quite a lot of the wealth in Egypt go through the imperial estates, which means that from the beginning, Egypt gets as you probably know, a different position And there's a reason you don't want senators to spend time in Egypt or have wells in Egypt, because if you cut off grain supply from Egypt to Rome, you have a problem. So most of the accumulation going there is either going to the imperial states. The other massive wealth accumulation that you can have in Egypt is through trade, but the percentage of trade going, for instance, to Berenike seems to again have imperial agents if the latest ideas are right about it. So that would be the probable explanation for it.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich habe zwei Fragen, die natürlich aus der Provinzperspektive kommen. Zunächst einmal die Frage, du hast von der Invention of the Roman Senate gesprochen. Ich habe mich gefragt, eben, welche Rolle den Provinzen dazukommt und eben vor allem schon den Provinzen bzw. den werdenden Provinzen in republikanischer Zeit, wo die Idee des römischen Senats natürlich sehr präsent ist. Wenn man die Inschriften liest, etwa aus der Zeit der Einrichtung der Provinz Asia, der römische Senat kommt da wieder und wieder und ist eben sehr, sehr präsent. Meine zweite Frage bezieht sich eher auf die Heimkehr, auf die Rückkehr, und du hast Pergamon angesprochen mit Julius Quadratus, der verfolgt uns in Pergamon. Jedes Jahr finden wir ein neues Fragment und wir sagen immer blind, das ist eine Quadratus-Statue, und das ist meistens so. Ja. Und da steht immer das Gleiche drauf, und am Anfang steht, oder gleich am Anfang, gleich nach der Erwähnung des Konsulats steht Septem vira epulonum fratrem arvalem, und das steht genau so. Das hat natürlich kein Mensch verstanden, was das eigentlich ist, und hat ihn aber sehr klar als etwas Fremdes zugleich markiert. Also dass er zumindest eben nicht mehr ganz dazugehört. Also diese Hybridität seiner Zugehörigkeit, die hat man natürlich auch sehr klar erfasst, obwohl man ihn natürlich eben auch mit diesen unzähligen Statuenweihungen für sich selbst reklamieren wollte. Könntest du zu diesem Spannungsverhältnis, das mir schon auch wichtig scheint, vielleicht noch mehr sagen?
Yeah, thanks. That is important. It's a sort of intrinsic tension in the way Rome rules its empire in general terms, right? And I've tried to stick to the Senate and senators, and this tension between the Senate as a body and senators as member of the Senate, but you can't really do that without looking at the way Rome as state entity, group of people, organizes its empire. And I would say that both points that you raise, so both the attention to the Senate as the Roman Senate in the inscription, and Quadratus as being external in many ways and Roman in many ways, is partly to continuously show that Rome is top dog. This, to me, reads a bit like putting the Res Gestae in Ancyra with a massive length of text saying what you've done in the city of Rome. So there's, and you're right, that probably means that corporate identity, that probably means that the idea of the Senate being a Roman Senate is more dominant in the provinces than the coins I show give testament to. I wonder, and I really wonder, to what extent, and there's no proof for this, to what extent this to people is the Roman Senate, or this to people is Rome. And Senate becomes a sort of SPQR shorthand, as in this is the power of Rome, the emperor and the Senate and all its ruling bodies, and this is what we see there. I think it may be in that line. Methodologically, I have no idea how you could ever prove that people saw differently about the Senate. I still find it noticeable that the Senate is then not presented the genius of the Senate in visual imagery, right? So you have that, the emperor is, the figure of Roma is, but the Senate isn't. So I would still say, yes, there is the perception that Rome is extremely important and the dominant power we have to deal with from the people in the various provinces. And you're right that one of the ways in which senators at their hometown show that they're top dog is by showing that they are this different group and being member of the Alvan Brethren is part of it. To what extent that means people look at the Senate as an institute, I don't know, but I wouldn't know how to either prove or disprove it. So any thoughts are welcome. It's a problem. Yeah.
Ja, vielen Dank. Sie haben die Auszählung der Senatoren nach den Provinzen gezeigt und erwähnt den einen Senator, der sagte, er ist der 5. aus der Provinz Asia. Ich frage mich, wie stark ist so ein Zusammengehörigkeitsgefühl der Senatoren aus den einzelnen Provinzen? Können wir das fassen? In welchem Verhältnis steht es dann zur quasi Identität als Senator gesamthaft?
Oh. It's an extremely good question. I wish I had the evidence for it. So you see bits of it within cities, which isn't your answer, right? So we see bits of it in Africa, where you see that there are inscriptions for the inscriptions for the senatorial elites in Thuga and Timgat and Bularegia seem to be interconnected, but that's physically close enough for it not to be there. We have the letter of Herodotus, which is a literary fiction. We have lots of letters. This is the other thing. The idea of letter writing and people writing letter to one another is the one thing that we do have. What I would need to do to really make this work, or what someone would need to do to really make this work, is start to look at the addressants of the different letters and see if there's a difference both in number and in tone to letters sent to other senators or letters sent to Equites. I think that's a really interesting research project for someone who's looking for one. But no, that would be what we would need to do to really show that this exists. So what I said, there's circumstantial evidence that there are connections if they really talk to one another. I don't know, could we do this with letters? We ought to be able to do it. Computer ought to be able to do it, right? But yeah. Do you have evidence? No.
Ja, ich hätte eine Frage zum Senat von Konstantinopel, also als er entstanden ist. Als ja das Senat von Konstantinopel entstanden ist, gab es diese Trennung von 2 Senaten. Gab es immer noch östliche Senatoren, die sich entschieden, lieber mehr in Rom zu sein, für diese Corporate Identity von Rom beizutragen, anstatt in Konstantinopel zu sein?
No. Easy question. If the emperor wanted you to be a senator in Constantinople, you were a senator in Constantinople or you were dead. So Senate of Constantinople is a very different beast from the Senate in Rome. Even the Senate in Rome at that stage, is slightly complicated as well, because obviously the emperor is sort of using senators to boost his claim with senators from Rome whilst he's in Ravenna. The Senate in Constantinople is much larger and much more directly linked to the emperor. Many more people become senator, or at least clarissimus, in the Constantinople area than before. So it's not an equal comparison. I find the fact that even in a Senate in which we know that the emperor decides who gets in it, and in a much smaller territory and a much larger group, that we still have laws discussing where your residence is interesting, because it shows that we still have these problems. That's the only reason I brought it in, because I do think it's a slightly other beast, also because the emperor becomes less mobile again. But yeah.
Dann darf ich auch noch ein paar Fragen loswerden.
Immer.
Ich fand es sehr spannend, dass du darauf hingewiesen hast, dass es ja auch Leute gibt, die die Ehre ablehnen. Hast du das systematisch untersucht, wie viele Fälle du da hast und kann man eine Korrelation zum Besitz oder zur wirtschaftlichen Aktivität vielleicht herstellen in diesem Zusammenhang?
So John Bodell did this research for an edited volume of, is it Annika Christina Kuhn? Sorry, that's unfair if your sister's working in the same field. Here. Oh, I didn't put it on the slide. That's very unfair of me. I will give you. I will give you the reference. And he looked at the period from Augustus to Hadrian, and he found 17 cases, substantial number in the Augustan period, and that's really the sort of not wanting to get involved in periods of crisis. More than this is this is the one where we can have the real suggestion. It's the strongest. Again, we have a source problem here.
Of course.
Because who is going to say that they turned it down?
Yeah.
So again, this is clear.
If you survived this,
if you survived it, you would have said you didn't want it before it was offered, wouldn't you? Right. This is the problem with this whole paper. To be perfectly honest, I think I'm right. I think the tension is clear. I think that I'm happy with. The tension is clear, and people were aware that there's a tension. Any moment you want to get into the nitty-gritty, most of the discussion and most of the argument will not have been dealt with officially. Because you're not going to do this officially.
Yeah, of course.
But then how do we know? So you can do this through comparison to an extent, and then we do see that, so.
Und vielleicht noch zum Abschluss, das ist ja jetzt viele über die Identität auch gesprochen worden und du hast die wunderbaren Sarkophag-Darstellungen gezeigt und du hast gesagt, eben, Senat as a corporate body is a fiction. Whose fiction?
A senatorial fiction. So I've spent a substantial part of my career telling colleagues that we shouldn't believe senators just because they wrote our texts. And that's the point I'm trying to make here as well, right? So everything's a fiction, right? Anything is a construct from that point of view. But I don't really want to go there. But the people to whom the existence of the Senate as a corporate group, as an identity that people can, as an institute that people can relate to is important, is the group of senators who are writing this. And I am convinced that because we have the senators writing this and only occasionally Tacitus saying this is perhaps not the right idea, we go with it. So this is to an extent, my ongoing discussion with Fergus, who was brilliant but gave a senatorial point of view of the Roman world. And I think we are all doing that when at the beginning I said Roman Senate and we all believed it. Why is it a Roman Senate when all the evidence is it's a group of individual senators? Senate doesn't exist. We have a group of individual senators who don't always agree and who have very mixed interests and who relate differently to different groups. So it's the fiction of the collaboration between emperor and senate. And that's important to both the emperor and the senate, which means it gets written down in our senatorial text, which means we believe it, which means we shouldn't believe it. So that's I think those fiction.
Wunderbar. Ich denke, das ist ein hervorragendes Schlusswort. Danke nochmal ganz herzlich und danke auch allen Teilnehmern.
Thank you.